Yes, indeed, folks. You're tuned in to Blue Please here on WoW Radio with myself, Total Biscuit. Welcome to the show. If you've just tuned in, you have missed 22 minutes of the show, which quite frankly is unacceptable, and I will be requiring heavy carry from you right about now. However, please put down a plastic sheet first, because you wouldn't want to stain your mother's best rug. Now, nostalgia. I've been on a nostalgia trip lately, as you might have expected, with the formation of Arcanist Belt. I mean, what can you call that if not nostalgia? That's the argument of certainly of Blizzard anyway, that the request for Classic Realms is nothing more than nostalgia. You know, it's a nostalgia trip that always ends up in you realizing, oh, actually no, I just had the grass is greener on the other side syndrome, and the content that I was supposed to be doing, i.e. the proper level content, is actually better. Now, up until Wrath, I would have actually agreed with that. I mean, I really would have. TBC instances were very good. I don't really know why people actually complained about them. I mean, I certainly didn't, not as far as I recall, and if I did, please, by all means, point out at themurloc@gmail.com which episode I actually said that in. But most of the TBC content, probably with the exception of Mount Hyjal, was pretty good. I mean, the raid content was relatively challenging, well-balanced and varied, and the loot tables were good, and everything was nice, sunny and fantastic. And of course, Sunwell apparently was the best instance ever made, so a lot of the hardcore raid guilds claim. Never got to go there, but I do intend to go there with Arcanist Belt at some point. Admittedly, it's going to be something of a watered down experience, bearing in mind it's been nerfed into the ground, but at least I'll get to try it out. Now, got to be thinking really as to where do you draw the line between an obvious nostalgia trip and a legitimate concern about the fact that some of the older content was actually better. I need to stop playing with things on my desk here. That it was actually better than the stuff in Wrath. That's a great question. Well, I suppose the first thing to look at with nostalgia would be actually to look at Naxx, because Naxx effectively is one giant nostalgia trip. And oddly enough, and it's probably the most appropriate example, it's an example of new content being worse than old content. Except the new content is the same as the old content. So it's a perfect example, so let's have a look at that. Now, back in the day, Naxx was pretty much the ultimate raid instance. A lot of people didn't get to see it, although quite a few people at least ventured in. The attunement process was not that bad, it wasn't terrible anyway. You could basically buy your way in, which is fine. Now, the first few bosses were killable by most capable guilds. Anyone that's killed Blackwing Lair bosses, if they killed Vale, they could probably kill Vesuvius, and they could probably kill Anubra Khan, and if they were really lucky, they could probably kill Grand Widow Fairlina. But aside from that, a lot of the, you were looking at very tough stuff. I mean, Patchwork was a DPS race. It was called Flaskwork for a reason. It was a very, very difficult fight to deal with. Extremely difficult. You're looking at, of course, Noth the Plaguebringer was an absolute nightmare, and don't even think about going any further into the Spiderwing, because my Exon's going to eat you, and Gothic the Harvester is just going to tear you apart. Now, it's interesting to note that a lot of those fights now are pretty much rendered down to walking jokes, and Gothic the Harvester is incredibly dull now, and incredibly easy. I can't imagine anyone actually wiping on Gothic the Harvester, because all it requires is the ability to DPS they ands, which, as far as I'm aware, everyone can do. And the ads aren't really that hard either. You don't get that many of them. You just stand there DPSing for like 5 or so minutes. The boss comes, doesn't really do anything of note. Teleports to the other side, doesn't do anything of note either. To about 40% or so, the gates open. Then you go and nuke him down. That's it, free loot. It's a box of loot. That's all it really is. Now, if you want to look at the nostalgia factor, you can look at how challenging Naxx was back in the day and whether or not it would still be challenging today. Well, obviously the current version of Naxx is not challenging because so many people have cleared it already. But the reason it's not challenging, well, there's a couple of reasons. First reason, I guess, would probably be the homogenization of classes, i.e. you don't really require any specific classes to do anything in Naxxramas, so we talked about that last week. But I think one of the other things that a lot of people seem to ignore, and perhaps they think, looking at Naxx now, that Naxx back in the day wasn't so great, is that the abilities of the bosses have been nerfed into the ground. Some have been removed, some have just been made utterly ineffective. And you're looking at stuff like Grand Widow Fairlina has been completely changed around in the way that you actually deal with her. And, of course, the 10-man version changes even more, but the 25-man version is still very, very easy. Vesuvius is mostly the same, but no. I mean, the big thing about Vesuvius back in the day, aside from the obvious mind control issues, which are still in there, is the fact that Vesuvius's disrupting shout would basically kill you in one hit unless you got out of line of sight. Yeah, seriously, I'm not kidding. That's what it would do. And it was a hefty ability, and people who were not on their toes were dead straight away. You got other fights like Heigen. Failing the dance on Heigen was a one-shot kill. It would kill you. There's not really a question about that. We can have a look at stuff like Loatheb, which required 3 greater shadow protection potions per attempt just to survive. Now, there's some things that I don't mind the removal of, like 3 greater shadow protection potions per attempt. Yeah, the use of consumables in that way was excessive. It was incredibly expensive, and it was pretty gimmicky, to be honest. It didn't serve any practical purpose other than to make raiders not have a lot of money, and to make people farm more, and I approve of the removal of some of the farming. I think they've gone a little bit too far. The use of 1 potion per fight, for instance, that is atrocious. I mean, it makes stuff like Potion of Haste pretty much useless. Other stuff, like the fact that you can only have a flask or an elixir, and you can only have two types of elixir, a battle elixir and a guardian elixir. Not a fan of that either. I liked actually stacking up on those kind of things, but never mind. That's by the by. And that, to some degree, could be considered nostalgia. I mean, Nax as an instance is well designed. The wings are very good. The bosses are not bad. And they're well spaced. And I think that's something that a lot of people do ignore about Nax. Why it was considered to be so great back in the day was the fact that they realised we don't care about trash. Trash is in the way to delay us. So they minimized it, but they made the trash challenging. No, very challenging. You had to be on your toes. But they minimized the amount of time it took to get from one boss to another. So it's like, instead of trash, boss, boss, i.e. like Molten Core, you had little bit of trash, boss, boss. Oh, that kind of rhythm, and it worked. The trash was relatively varied, it was pretty interesting, there was a lot of very cool mechanics involved, like for instance the gargoyles, and the fact that you had to DPS them down incredibly quickly, otherwise they get back to full health. You also had the shades, which are like, oh lol, I am shadow bolting everything, and the slimes, which are like, oh lol, if I touch you, you're very, very dead, so you got to kite us all over the place. Oh, and we change colour, so yeah, good luck consistently nuking us with one type of magic. Now that was pretty interesting. Also the Mad Doctor trash packs and stuff like that. Mad Scientists. They were great. The Abomination packs. All of this stuff was well-designed trash. But the pacing was pretty much bang-on perfect. And the pacing remains. In the new Nax, the pacing does remain. So that's one thing we can give it on the positive side of things. The problem is, instead of trash challenging boss, you now got trash joke boss. It's like, now the trash genuinely is there just to slow you up. You might as well just knock the bosses over one after another. Make a house of cards out of them. Have a domino run. Just knock one down, the rest fall over. That's pretty much how it works. Now, the flip side of nostalgia is the people who say, oh, Molten Core was so great. Oh, we should have a heroic Molten Core. Have you ever been to Molten Core? I mean, really, anyone who has ever been to Molten Core could not possibly, with a straight face, make that argument. No. Absolutely not. Molten Core is not what I am looking forward to. When Arcanist Belt reaches 60, a lot of us are there already, and starts to do Molten Core, that will be the point where I say to my guys, you had better be focused and you had better be ready for power pulling, because I am not spending 8 hours in this crap hole. It's awful. It's a terribly designed instance. The trash is dull and there's too much of it. It's called Molten Bore or Molten Snore for a reason. Really, it's not very good. You've got bosses that look like trash, and most of them aren't all that interesting. Some are, don't get me wrong, some are interesting, but it was a really boring instance, and it took way too long to do. Thankfully, they brought in Zul'Gurub and AQ20, which had better loot, and at that point you could pretty much skip Molten Core almost entirely, and just go straight to Blackwing Lair, which was hard. Initially that was very hard. Blackwing Lair is like, right, okay, no trash, here's a brick wall, bang! That's you into it for the next 5 weeks until you work out how to do Razor Gore. And it's like, yay, we did that. Oh, look, there's no trash. Bang! Another brick wall. Veil Straz. And then you can have some trash. And Blackwing Lair had a lot less trash. A lot less. And most of it was pretty fun. I like the trash in Blackwing Lair. Admittedly, a few of the bosses suffered from Molten Core Syndrome, i.e. the Drakes. The Drakes suffered from Molten Core Syndrome. Because they were just dull, generic encounters. But Chromagus was a good encounter, Nefarian was a good encounter, Veilstraz, Razorgore, and to some degree, Brute Lord Lash Lair. It was alright. But the Drakes were just incredibly boring. And then you go on, of course, to AQ40, which was a way larger instance. Had a lot more trash, but the trash was challenging. To some degree, too challenging. Cthulhu trash still gives me nightmares. It was ridiculous. To the point where some hardcore guild got themselves banned for exploiting their way past that trash. I can totally understand why they would have done that. It is horrible. But the bosses in there, I think, were some of the most inventive. Really, every boss in there was cool in one way or another. I remember doing Prophet Scarum in his huge arena where he's booming his rhetoric and religious stuff, and it was just great. It's great to hear. And the boss was cool with the 3-spawn mechanic was fantastic. And, of course, it was one of the first bosses where we actually saw that mind control. And mind control did make the fight very, very interesting. So that was good. And then we had Battleguard Satura, who was like, oh lord, like spinning death. They brought her in, the mechanic in, to a lesser extent in Leothorus the Blind in SSC. But Satura was just a nightmare. On legs. I mean, on wings, whichever you prefer. Then we got Thancred the Unyielding, who was not that great, and he also wasn't unyielding. I'm sorry, it just was a lie. But then you had that interesting encounter, the 3 bugs, the bug trio, which you could kill in different orders to get different loot, and that was actually one of the first examples of a hard mode in the game, yeah? That's where it came from. It's not new in Wrath at all. That was actually kind of an optional hard mode, because I believe let me just think. Killing Vem... Sorry, no, it was Vem, Kree, and Yauj, and I think you killed Lord Kree first. And then you killed Yauj, and then you left Vem till the end, and that was the easiest. And you could leave Yauj to the end as the second easiest, and then the hardest is if you left Lord Kree to the end. Because of his poison attack, it was hard, it was really difficult. And once you kill one of them, the bugs went and devoured the other one. So that only the last one remaining would have the loot on it. It was really nifty. Cool idea. And I recall being very intrigued by that. We had, of course, other bosses. They had 2 optional bosses in there, both of which were very cool. Oro, the big sandworm, which was fantastic. It's a wonderful encounter. And Viscidus, who I never actually got to use, but you'll notice a dumbed-down version of Viscidus in Violet Hold, the elemental boss that splits. That's pretty much one of the similar mechanics to Viscidus. And he was cool. And then, of course, we had Cthulhu, which in my opinion is the most inventive and challenging fight they've ever put together. But then again, I haven't been at the Sunwell, so perhaps I'm missing out there. Now, all of this stuff is pretty factual. I state my opinions pretty openly, and I don't necessarily back them up with all the facts required, but then again, I do invite people to disagree. Feel free, themurloc@gmail.com is the place to go, or post on my forum. You can disagree there. But in my opinion, that content that I've just listed right there was interesting for the reasons I've just given. And that's not nostalgia, that's objective fact. It's objective fact that Cthulhu was a challenging 2-stage encounter with many unique mechanics. That's a fact. That's not an opinion, that is a fact. And there's also the fact that nothing like that has ever been put in the game since. There is nothing like Cthulhu. And Cthulhu will always remain unique and interesting for that reason. Now that ain't nostalgia. And I think that people have to realise that when some people pine for that kind of content, they actually are genuinely pining for it, and they're not just looking at the past through rose-tinted spectacles. I'm not. I know there was plenty wrong with the stuff at the time, but I remember having a lot of fun back then, and I remember, well, some of it's probably because this was new, but I would expect a lot of it is because the instances were well designed and challenging. There is no fun at all in doing an instance that is not challenging, because you do not believe you deserve the rewards. Do you really believe that knocking over joke bosses like Gothic the Harvester and the new Nax, do you believe that you deserve the 4 pieces of loot that you get from that? Really? Do you believe that? Because I don't. VOA, I felt guilty from getting 2 pieces of tier 7.5. Oh look, best chest piece and best legs in the game for me. Great. What did I do for that again? Now, I do pine for the days when I had to work for my loot, and I do pine for the days when our guild had to work for their kills. And that's something I'd like to see again with Ulduar. In the meantime, of course, we'll be trying to at least recapture some of that feeling with Arcanist Belt, and don't worry, I will let you know how it goes. My name is Total Biscuit, and you're listening to Blue Please here on WoW Radio. Some Skindred for you, it's Set It Off. I'll be right back after this, folks. Enjoy.